The sun rose with an unsettling calmness, casting an eerie golden hue over the world below. For most people, the morning was just another routine, but for Caleb Thompson, it was the beginning of something far worse than a bad day. The alarm clock blared its usual shrill tune, forcing him to pull himself from the warmth of his blankets. He rubbed his eyes, stretched, and forced a yawn. He glanced at his phone, no new notifications, no messages, just the time. The coffee machine hummed in the background as he moved to the kitchen, trying to shake off the grogginess of sleep. The faint sound of birds chirping outside seemed almost too cheerful. Caleb paused, staring out the window, but something didn't feel right. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the world was holding its breath. He shook his head. It was just his imagination. Lately, everything had been off. The news had been dominated by strange reports of violence and unrest, but nothing had seemed catastrophic. The pandemic was still ongoing, but people were managing. The authorities had done their best to keep things under control. Surely, everything would return to normal soon. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. As Caleb poured himself a cup of coffee, his phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. A message from his sister, Lauren, popped up. "Have you heard the news?" it read. He quickly typed back, "No, what's going on?" Before she could respond, a loud crash echoed from somewhere outside. Caleb froze, his heart thumping in his chest. It wasn't like anything he'd ever heard before. The sound was followed by what sounded like shouting, a mix of panic and rage. He moved toward the window, his pulse quickening as he peered outside. What he saw made his stomach lurch. At first, he thought it was a gathering crowd, maybe some protest or a group of people caught in a skirmish. But the closer he looked, the more he realized something was horribly wrong. People were running, stumbling over one another. Some of them were attacking each other, tearing at clothes, grabbing limbs with disturbing intensity. It looked like chaos, but it wasn't just chaos, it was violence without reason. The kind of violence that didn't stop. A woman near a park bench screamed as a man lunged at her, biting her neck with an animalistic frenzy. His teeth sank into her skin, and she let out a horrified cry. Caleb recoiled, his breath caught in his throat. This wasn't normal. What the hell was happening? His phone buzzed again. Lauren's message flashed across the screen, "Turn on the TV." They say it's happening everywhere. With a racing heartbeat, Caleb dashed to the living room, grabbing the remote and switching on the TV. The news anchor's voice was frantic, barely able to control the terror in her tone. "Breaking news, reports are flooding in from all over the country. People have begun to turn on each other, attacking without warning. Authorities have issued a state of emergency, but there's no clear explanation for the violence. Eyewitnesses claim that the victims are, well, they're not dying. They're not staying down. They're attacking anyone they can find. Hospitals are overwhelmed, and panic is spreading quickly." Caleb's mind raced as he tried to process what he was hearing. This was no ordinary civil disturbance. This was something darker, something far more terrifying. But as much as he tried to convince himself otherwise, he knew deep down that what he was seeing, what was happening outside, wasn't something any government, any hospital, or any amount of preparation could control. The anchor continued, "We're receiving reports from multiple cities, and the situation seems to be getting worse by the minute. The president has issued a national quarantine order. Do not leave your homes under any circumstances. Lock all doors and windows. Stay inside until further instructions are given." The message was clear, but it didn't seem like enough. Caleb turned back to the window, his gaze fixed on the chaotic scene unfolding in front of him. The people outside had descended into madness. They were everywhere, attacking anyone in sight, and those who were attacked didn't stay down. They got up. They came back, more desperate than before. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Lauren. "Caleb, please, what's happening? I saw the news. Are you okay?" Her voice trembled on the other end, barely able to contain her fear. "I don't know," Caleb muttered, his eyes glued to the chaos outside. "I don't know what's going on, Lauren, but it's not just happening here. It's happening everywhere. People, they're not staying dead. He paused, his voice failing him as he tried to wrap his mind around the unthinkable. They're attacking. It's like something out of a nightmare. Lauren's voice cracked. Caleb, we need to get out of here. We need to go to the safe zone. The line cut off abruptly. Caleb's heart raced. The world outside was spiraling into chaos, and there was no escaping it. The rules of society, of civilization, were no longer in place. It was a new reality, one that he wasn't prepared for. And in that moment, as he looked out at the destruction spreading across the world, he realized that this was no longer just a nightmare. It was real. And it was only just beginning. Caleb's thoughts were scattered, disjointed, as he stared at the chaos unfolding just beyond his window. His hands shook, and the cup of coffee he had been holding slipped from his grasp, shattering against the floor. The world outside seemed like a fever dream, a nightmare that had been unleashed without warning. He barely heard his phone buzzing in his pocket. It wasn't until it vibrated again that he snapped back to reality. He quickly pulled it out, his eyes darting over the screen. It was a message from Lauren. The words were brief, but they hit him like a punch to the gut. I'm coming over. Stay inside. Don't let anyone in. His mind raced. What could he possibly do? The streets outside were filled with violence, with people attacking one another in ways that seemed impossible, and he was stuck in the middle of it. There was nowhere safe. No place where the madness didn't reach. Taking a deep breath, Caleb forced himself to focus. He needed to think clearly. He needed to survive. But even as the words echoed in his mind, doubt crept in. How could anyone survive this? He looked back at the TV. The news anchor was struggling to maintain her composure, her face pale and tight with fear. We are receiving more reports from across the country. What began as a series of isolated incidents has now spread to major cities. People are being attacked by others who seem to be not themselves. Authorities are still working to understand the nature of these attacks, but we urge everyone to remain indoors. Do not attempt to make contact with anyone outside your immediate family. Remain barricaded in your homes until further notice. Caleb grabbed his jacket, heading toward the door. He couldn't sit here, not knowing if Lauren was safe, not knowing if the world would still be standing by the time he left. But as he approached the door, a thought gripped him. Should he really leave? Was the world outside so dangerous that there was no escaping it? If his sister was coming here, would it even be safe for her to get in? He didn't want to make any more mistakes, not in a world like this. The air around him felt suffocating, charged with a tension he couldn't escape. Everything he had known, everything he had relied on, was crumbling. His home, the place he'd always thought of as a safe haven, felt more like a prison now. As he turned to look out the window once again, a movement caught his eye. A figure was stumbling down the street, dragging itself forward with disturbing, jerky motions. Its clothes were torn, and its face was covered in dirt and blood. Caleb's breath caught in his throat as the figure got closer. It looked wrong. It wasn't human anymore. The creature, a man, or at least what used to be a man, wasn't walking. It was dragging itself forward, its hands twisted at unnatural angles, reaching out toward anything it could grab. Its mouth was open wide, jaw slack, teeth bared in an eerie grimace. Caleb could see that its eyes were empty, like glass marbles, unseeing, but somehow aware. It didn't stumble. It didn't fall. It kept coming. Before Caleb could even react, the creature's head jerked up, locking eyes with him. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then, without warning, it lurched toward the window, its movements violent and desperate. Caleb stumbled back in horror, but the figure never broke its gaze. The creature was hungry. A shrill cry pierced the air from outside, followed by more sounds of chaos. People were screaming now, screaming for help, screaming in fear. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. What was happening? Was this some sort of plague? A contagion that spread too quickly to stop? Caleb grabbed his phone, his fingers fumbling as he tried to reach Lauren again. He needed to know she was safe. But as the phone rang, he heard another noise from outside. The distant sound of tires screeching, engines revving, and the unmistakable thud of doors slamming open. More people were outside. More of those things. And they were coming closer. Stay inside. Don't let anyone in. Lauren's words echoed in his mind, but the situation had changed. There was no guarantee that staying inside would keep him safe anymore. The world outside was already lost. Caleb rushed to the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the block, feeling the cold steel in his hand. It was all he had, and it felt so insignificant compared to what he was facing. The reality of the situation was sinking in. This wasn't just a riot or a terror attack. This wasn't something that could be contained by police or emergency services. This was the end of the world. The rules had changed. The front door shook. Caleb's breath caught. Someone was at the door. Knock. A soft knock, almost tentative. Caleb pressed himself against the wall, his breath shallow. Should he open it? Was it a survivor, or had they already been turned? He waited for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds outside. The cries had died down, replaced by an eerie silence. A shiver ran down his spine as he crept toward the door. He hesitated. Another knock. His mind screamed to open it, to check if Lauren was out there, but the logical side of him, what was left of it, told him that trusting anyone could be a fatal mistake. He had to be sure. Then, through the peephole, Caleb saw a figure standing there. His heart skipped a beat. It was Lauren. But before he could react, a new sound reached his ears, footsteps, loud and fast, growing nearer. And with that, the reality of what he was facing hit him hard. The world outside wasn't the same. It would never be the same again. And there was no going back. The door handle rattled again, more urgently this time. Caleb stood frozen for a moment, staring through the peephole. His heart raced, pounding in his chest as adrenaline surged through his veins. He could hear Lauren's muffled voice on the other side, but there was something off about it. It was frantic, pleading, but with an edge of fear he had never heard before. Caleb, please open the door. It's me. It's Lauren. Her voice cracked with desperation. His hand hovered over the lock, but hesitation gripped him. The world outside was no longer the world he had known. People were attacking one another, tearing each other apart, and those who were turned into things were no longer human. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the street, snapping Caleb out of his trance. It was followed by more screams. This time, they were closer. Too close. His thoughts raced. Was it really Lauren? Had she been attacked? Was she even still human? He had to act. Without wasting another second, Caleb unlocked the door and swung it open, his breath held tight in his chest. The figure standing before him wasn't Lauren, at least, not completely. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and frantic, but there was something in them, something wrong. Her clothes were torn, and blood stained the front of her shirt. Caleb, she gasped, her voice strained. Let me in. Please. She stumbled forward, but Caleb caught her just before she collapsed. Lauren, what happened? His voice shook with concern as he pulled her inside. She was trembling, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. There were too many of them. I saw it happen, Caleb. I saw people change. They weren't themselves anymore. And they were after me. Caleb quickly shut the door, locking it again. He didn't know how much time they had, but he could feel the clock ticking. His heart pounded in his chest as he backed away from the door, pulling Lauren to a nearby chair. He needed answers, but she was clearly in no condition to explain. Lauren, are you okay? He asked, his voice tight with fear. She nodded weakly, but it didn't ease his growing dread. There was something in the way she looked at him, something that didn't quite match the person he knew. It was almost like she was seeing him for the first time, as if she was struggling to process him, struggling to remember who he was. Before Caleb could ask her anything more, a loud bang sounded from the kitchen. His body went stiff. His instincts screamed at him to run, to hide, but the only thing he could do was check. "Stay here," he said urgently, his voice low. Lauren nodded weakly, her eyes fixed on the floor, almost as though she wasn't fully present. Caleb moved cautiously toward the kitchen. His steps were slow and deliberate as he approached the doorway. Another bang, louder this time. Then, a low growl. His pulse quickened. He peeked around the corner, his breath shallow. What he saw made his stomach turn. A creature, no, a person, was standing in the kitchen. Its body was twisted in unnatural ways, its eyes wide and bloodshot. It sniffed the air, moving in erratic jerks as it sought out its next victim. The thing was covered in blood, and pieces of what looked like torn clothing hung from its body. The worst part was the gnawing sound it made as it chewed on what seemed to be a pile of something unrecognizable. It wasn't human anymore. Caleb recoiled, barely keeping his composure. His fingers closed around the knife he had grabbed earlier, the cold steel offering little comfort. His mind raced. He wasn't ready for this. There was no way to be ready for something like this. He had to protect Lauren. He had to protect himself. With a deep breath, Caleb stepped into the kitchen, holding the knife out in front of him. The creature, still chewing, didn't notice him at first. Then, the thing turned its head, its eyes locking onto Caleb. The growl grew louder, more guttural. The creature took a step forward, moving faster than Caleb had expected. It lunged. Time seemed to slow as Caleb instinctively swung the knife, slashing across the creature's face. It screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman sound that made Caleb's blood run cold. But the creature didn't stop. It came at him again, this time more ferocious, its mouth open wide in an attempt to bite him. Adrenaline surged through Caleb, and he pushed forward, using the knife to stab the creature in the chest. It staggered back, but it didn't fall. The thing roared in agony, a sound that rattled the very bones of the house. Caleb's hands were shaking, his heart racing as he struggled to keep his grip on the knife. Finally, with one last desperate strike, the knife sank deep into the creature's throat. It let out a final gurgled scream before collapsing onto the floor, its body twitching in its death throes. Caleb stood over it, panting, sweat dripping down his face. He didn't know how long he stood there, staring at the lifeless form of what had once been a person. The silence in the house was deafening. He needed to find Lauren. He needed to get out of here. When Caleb returned to the living room, Lauren was gone. His heart skipped a beat. The door was wide open. No. He ran toward the door, panic overtaking him. But before he could reach it, he heard her voice, a soft, almost sickening sound, coming from outside. The same desperation, the same pleading, but it was different now. It was colder. "Caleb," Lauren's voice called, almost in a sing-song tone. "Come outside, Caleb. It's better out here. Come see. It's better." Caleb froze. That was not Lauren's voice anymore. It couldn't be. His sister was gone. The world outside was no longer just a nightmare. It was his reality now. The air inside Caleb's home felt thick, suffocating, as he stood frozen, staring at the open door. Lauren's voice called to him from outside again, each word twisted, sickly sweet, but full of something dark, something that didn't belong. A part of him wanted to rush out, to see if it was really her, to bring her back in and protect her. But the logical part of his mind, the part that was still holding on to sanity, screamed at him to stay inside. The Lauren he knew, the one who would never hurt him, the one who had been his best friend for years, was gone. The creature outside, mimicking her voice, was not his sister. It was something else. Something worse. Caleb's hands trembled as he slowly closed the door, the eerie silence surrounding him now like a tomb. He leaned back against it, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. His mind was a whirlwind of panic and confusion. He had just killed one of those things in the kitchen, and now, it felt as though his entire world had collapsed. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, paralyzed by fear. But then the sounds outside grew louder. More growls. More shrieks. The world outside his walls had turned into a terrifying cacophony of violence and despair. He had no illusions left. The world he had known, his normal life, was over. The rules had changed, and now survival meant living in constant fear, never knowing when or where the next attack would come from. His thoughts turned back to Lauren. She was out there. What if she was still alive somewhere? What if there was a chance to save her? But deep down, Caleb knew the truth. If she was alive, she had already changed. It was too late. But that didn't stop him from thinking about her. He couldn't help it. The person who had raised him, who had protected him, who had been there through every hardship, was gone. And there was no way to bring her back. The weight of his own guilt settled heavily on his chest. He should have done something. He should have stopped her from leaving, should have forced her to stay inside. But it was too late. The world outside had turned to chaos, and he had no idea if anyone was left. A knock at the door brought him back to the present. It was softer than before, almost hesitant. His breath caught in his throat, and he froze, unwilling to move. Is it her? The thought crossed his mind in an instant. But even as the hope flickered within him, he quickly pushed it aside. No. That couldn't be her. This was some twisted trick. But what if it wasn't? The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. A different voice. Caleb. Please, we need help. Let us in. It was a man's voice, shaky but urgent. Caleb's hand hovered over the doorknob, his heart pounding in his chest. Should he open it? Should he take the risk? He had been so careful not to trust anyone, not to let anyone in. He had seen what happened to those who let their guard down. Another voice joined the first, a woman's this time. Please. We're not infected. We just need shelter. You can't stay here alone. It's not safe. Caleb's mind raced. Could they be telling the truth? Could they be survivors like him, desperate to escape the chaos outside? Or was this another trap, or ruse to lure him into the open? He didn't know who to trust anymore. The world had turned upside down in the blink of an eye, and now everyone was a potential threat. But his instincts told him he couldn't stay here forever. If he was going to survive, he would need allies. He would need other survivors. The thought of facing this nightmare alone was too much to bear. Slowly, he approached the door, his pulse hammering in his ears. With a deep breath, he placed his hand on the doorknob, ready to make his decision. But just before he turned it, a loud crash from the street shattered the stillness. A car had collided with a nearby building, the explosion sending a shockwave through the house. Caleb staggered back, his ears ringing, heart racing in panic. He glanced out the window, but all he could see were shadows moving in the distance, figures running, screaming, disappearing into the chaos. The world outside was worse than he had imagined. The voices at the door pleaded again, but Caleb's mind was elsewhere now. He had to think. He had to plan. The first thing he knew was that he couldn't stay here. The house wasn't safe anymore. Even if these people weren't infected, it didn't matter. They weren't alone out there. More of those things were coming. The streets were filled with them. The second thing he knew was that he had no idea where he was going. But he couldn't stay in this place of false security. He had to find somewhere, anywhere, that could offer a chance at survival. He slowly unlocked the door, the hinges creaking loudly in the quiet of the house. When he opened it, he was greeted by two figures standing in the doorway. A man and a woman, both disheveled and bloodied, but alive. Their faces were filled with fear, but also relief. We're not infected, the man said, his voice rough from panic. We just need help. Caleb stood there for a moment, his heart still racing. There was something in the man's eyes, a look of desperation, of raw humanity, that made Caleb take a step forward. "Come in," he said, his voice low, hesitant. As the strangers stepped inside, Caleb quickly closed the door behind them, locking it again. For the first time in what felt like forever, he let out a breath. There was no way to know for sure if they were trustworthy, but right now, they were his only option. The world outside was falling apart, but in that moment, with these two people at his side, Caleb realized something. He was no longer alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to survive another day. But he knew the road ahead would be long, and the choices would be harder. Trusting others, even in the face of the apocalypse, might be his only hope. But it could also be his undoing. The journey ahead was uncertain. Survival was no longer just about staying alive. It was about the choices he made and the people he chose to stand beside. And Caleb had already made his first choice. The house was silent now, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floors as Caleb moved about. He had let the strangers in, but a creeping sense of unease lingered in the air. It wasn't just the feeling of impending danger. It was the realization that the rules of survival had changed. Trust was no longer something you could take for granted. It was a luxury, a rare commodity in a world gone mad. The two strangers, the man and the woman, had quickly introduced themselves as John and Emily. They were both in their late 20s, rough around the edges, with disheveled hair and bruised, bloodied skin. The woman's arm was bandaged hastily, a faint trail of red seeping through the fabric. The man had a deep cut along his cheek, a thin line of scarlet still visible on his face. They looked like they had been through hell, but they were alive. Caleb had offered them water and some of the canned food he'd been hoarding. John and Emily had accepted silently, their eyes constantly scanning the room, as if they expected the walls to collapse at any moment. Caleb could tell they were just as scared as he was, maybe even more so. They had been out there, in the streets, trying to survive. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that their arrival had changed everything. They were no longer just two strangers, they were a risk. There was no way to know if they were genuinely trustworthy or if they had something to hide. The minutes dragged by. Caleb found himself pacing, his mind whirling with too many thoughts. He glanced at John and Emily, who were sitting at the small table in the corner, quietly talking in hushed tones. They seemed to be plotting their next move. They were planning something. Caleb didn't like it. "We need to leave soon," John said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, but determined. "This place isn't safe. We've seen the streets, they're crawling with them. The longer we stay here, the more likely we'll get trapped." Emily nodded, her face pale but resolute. "We can't waste any more time. We're better off moving while we still have daylight. The longer we wait, the harder it'll be to get out." Caleb didn't know what to think. On one hand, John and Emily were right. The streets outside were teeming with the infected. Every minute they spent waiting in this house was another minute they were exposed to the horrors beyond the door. But on the other hand, Caleb wasn't sure if he was ready to leave yet. The house was at least a known quantity. It offered shelter, for now. What about supplies? Caleb asked, his voice hesitant. "We're not exactly stocked up for a long trip. We don't know what we'll find out there. I need to plan." "We've already gathered what we could find," John replied, his eyes dark with worry. "Food, water, a few tools. But we need to move fast. The longer we stay, the more of those things will show up. And once they find us, it's over. You saw what happened in the streets. We're not safe here anymore." Caleb looked at Emily, who had been quiet up until now. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. She was already thinking about what came next. "Caleb," Emily said, her voice calm but firm. "We're not going to make it if we don't act now. You can't hide forever. We need to keep moving, keep finding other survivors. Together, we have a chance. Alone, we don't stand a chance." Her words hit Caleb harder than he expected. She was right. This wasn't the time to hold on to the past. His home, his life, those were gone. The world was gone. This was a new reality, one where survival meant taking risks, trusting others, and accepting that nothing would ever be the same again. But was he ready to take that leap? Caleb walked to the window and peered out, his hand resting on the cool glass. The street was empty now, save for a few flickering shadows in the distance. The chaos had subsided for the moment, but Caleb knew it wouldn't last. It never did. With a deep breath, he turned back to John and Emily. "Okay," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that gripped him. "Let's move. But we do this together. We stay alert. We don't trust anyone we meet out there. And we stick to the plan." John gave him a sharp nod. "Deal." Emily smiled faintly, but there was a sadness behind her eyes. "We're with you. We'll survive together. We have to." Caleb's stomach twisted at the thought. He hadn't truly made a plan. Not yet. He had no idea where they were going, or what they would find when they got there. But there was no time for second-guessing. The decision was made. "We'll head out first thing in the morning," Caleb said, his mind already racing. "But we need to get some rest. We'll need our energy for whatever comes next." John and Emily both nodded, and the three of them fell into a quiet routine. Caleb kept watch by the window, Emily took inventory of their supplies, and John checked the door to make sure it was securely locked. They didn't speak much after that, there was no need. They all knew what was at stake. As night fell and the shadows in the house grew longer, Caleb allowed himself a brief moment to close his eyes. The world outside was still there, but it felt like another lifetime. The life he had once known was gone. And now, there was only the fight to survive. The next morning would be their first step into an unknown world, filled with danger and uncertainty. Caleb didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was clear, he couldn't afford to trust anyone completely, not even John and Emily. The road ahead would be long. But Caleb had already made up his mind. He would survive. No matter what. The sun had barely begun to rise when Caleb, John, and Emily gathered their meager supplies and prepared to leave the house. The morning air was cool, with a faint chill that hinted at the approaching winter. The streets outside were still eerily quiet, the only sounds being the distant groans of the infected that echoed faintly through the empty town. Caleb felt a knot form in his stomach as he looked around one last time at the house he'd called home. It had been his sanctuary in this nightmare, a place where he had convinced himself that maybe, just maybe, it was possible to survive. But now, it felt like nothing more than a tomb, and the road ahead was the only option left. "Are we ready?" Caleb asked, his voice low but steady. John gave him a quick nod, adjusting the strap on his backpack. "We're as ready as we'll ever be." Emily, her expression hard but her eyes betraying a deep sadness, surveyed the house one final time before turning to Caleb. "We can't afford to waste any more time. The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it gets. Let's move." Caleb nodded in agreement, his hand lingering on the door handle for a moment longer than he'd intended. It felt like stepping into the unknown, a world where everything had changed, where every corner held a new threat. But he knew this was the only way to survive. With a deep breath, Caleb swung open the door, the creak of the hinges sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. Outside, the world seemed untouched by time, but Caleb knew better. The calm was just an illusion. As they stepped out into the street, Caleb's gaze swept over their surroundings. The once bustling neighborhood was now a ghost town, with abandoned cars lined up along the curb and buildings standing like silent witnesses to the collapse of civilization. The only sign of life, or rather, unlife, was the occasional movement in the shadows. "Keep your eyes open," Caleb said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to move fast. Stick to the alleys, stay out of sight." John and Emily nodded, their faces grim. There was no need for further explanation. They had all seen what the world had become, and they knew how dangerous it was to be out in the open. As they made their way down the street, Caleb couldn't help but think about the world that had once been. The world where people didn't have to worry about hiding in fear every day. The world where you could go to sleep at night and wake up in the morning without wondering if the world outside would still be there. But that world was gone. Now, all that mattered was survival. And survival meant adapting to the new reality. The group moved cautiously, taking detours around abandoned cars and sidestepping the scattered debris. They didn't speak much, each person lost in their own thoughts, but their body language said everything. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. They were on high alert, ready for anything. The first sign of trouble came just as they turned a corner onto a narrower street. A soft, distant groaning echoed through the alley, followed by a rustling sound. Caleb motioned for the group to stop, holding up his hand to signal silence. His heart pounded in his chest as he motioned them to crouch low behind a pile of rubble. The noises grew louder, closer. A group of infected appeared in the street ahead, stumbling and groaning, their clothes tattered and their skin decayed. There were at least 6 of them, shambling, uncoordinated, but with an unrelenting drive to hunt anything alive. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. They were too close. If they kept moving forward, they'd be spotted. He glanced at John and Emily, both crouched low beside him, their faces tense with fear. "We need to stay still," Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't make a sound." They waited, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. The infected were moving sluggishly, their eyes vacant and their focus fixed on nothing in particular. But Caleb knew they could smell them. They could hear the slightest sound. His pulse raced as one of the infected stumbled a little too close to their hiding spot. Caleb held his breath, his entire body frozen in place, praying they wouldn't be noticed. The infected passed by, their grotesque forms just inches away. Caleb felt the air on his skin as they brushed past, but they never stopped. The group held their position, eyes wide and hearts racing, until the last of the infected had passed. Only then did Caleb dare to exhale, his body shaking with the adrenaline of the near miss. "That was too close," Emily whispered, her voice tight with tension. "We can't keep doing this," John added, his jaw clenched. "We need a plan." Caleb nodded, his mind racing. This wasn't sustainable. They couldn't just keep running and hiding. They needed to find shelter. A safer place. Something with walls, with security, something to give them a fighting chance. He turned to John and Emily, his eyes resolute. "We can't keep moving without a plan. We need to find somewhere we can hold up for a while, regroup. There has to be somewhere around here that's still standing, maybe a fortified building, something." Emily's eyes searched the area around them, scanning the wreckage of the town. "There's an old school nearby. It's a few blocks from here. I think it was used as a shelter early on, but I'm not sure if anyone's still there." "That's our best bet," Caleb said, his mind made up. "We head there. But we move quickly. We don't stop for anything unless it's absolutely necessary." With their course of action set, the group pressed on, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the streets as best they could. The journey was tense, each step taken with caution. They couldn't afford another close call, and as they made their way toward the school, Caleb couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Every choice they made now was a gamble. But it was a gamble they had to take if they were going to survive. The world outside was no longer a place of comfort or certainty. It was a place where danger lurked around every corner, where trust was a luxury, and where survival was a constant fight. And Caleb knew one thing for sure: if they were going to make it through this, they needed to stick together. Trust, even if it was fragile, was the only thing keeping them alive. The school loomed ahead, its silhouette dark against the rising sun. From a distance, it appeared abandoned, its windows shattered, the entrance door hanging ajar as if it had been left in a hurry. There was no sign of movement. No sounds of the infected. For a moment, it felt like a quiet oasis in the chaos. But Caleb wasn't fooled. "Stay sharp," Caleb murmured, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the building. "We don't know what we'll find inside." John and Emily nodded, their faces still tense from the close call they had just endured. The streets had been eerily quiet after the group of infected passed, but the silence was unsettling. Every step felt like it could be their last. They approached the entrance carefully, Caleb taking the lead, with John and Emily following closely behind. As they neared the door, Caleb paused, listening. There was no sound, no groans, no moaning. He motioned for them to wait, then slowly pushed the door open with a creak that seemed deafening in the stillness. Inside, the hallway was dark, save for the thin light filtering through the broken windows. Desks and chairs were scattered, some overturned, some crushed under the weight of debris. It was clear that this place had once been a haven, at least for a while. But like everywhere else, it had been abandoned when it became too dangerous. Caleb led the group inside, his every sense on high alert. His footsteps echoed in the empty hall as he cautiously stepped forward. There were no signs of the infected here, no signs of life, at all. The school was abandoned. But something about it felt wrong. The silence was suffocating, and the air smelled stale, like something had been left to rot. "Let's keep moving," Caleb said quietly, his voice low but urgent. "We don't have time to waste." They moved through the halls, passing empty classrooms and locker rooms. It was hard to shake the feeling that they weren't alone, even though there was no one else around. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the floorboards felt like it came from something sinister lurking just out of sight. The further they went into the building, the more it felt like they were descending deeper into something they couldn't escape. The walls were marked with signs of the world's descent into chaos, broken windows, bloodstains on the floors, scratched-up doors where people had tried to barricade themselves in. The classrooms, once filled with eager students, now stood empty and desolate, their desks left in disarray. It was as though the world had moved on, leaving nothing but the remnants of a lost time. Caleb's mind raced as they reached the end of the hallway. There was a door at the far end, slightly ajar, leading to what appeared to be the school's gymnasium. Caleb hesitated. This was it, the place they had been aiming for. He felt an unsettling pull in his chest, as though he was about to step into a trap, but he had no other choice. "We'll check the gym," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty that swirled in his mind. "If it's clear, we make our stand here. If not, we move again." The three of them stepped cautiously into the gym, the space vast and silent, bathed in the pale light coming through the high, broken windows. The bleachers were empty, the court covered in dust, but Caleb's instincts were telling him something was off. There was an odd smell in the air, something stale, almost musty. He couldn't put his finger on it, but it made his stomach churn. The gym seemed empty at first glance, but as they moved further inside, Caleb's eyes were drawn to the far corner of the room. He froze, motioning for the others to stay still. In the corner, partially obscured by shadows, was a pile of old gym bags and scattered belongings. It looked like someone had tried to hide there, but something about it felt off. "Stay back," Caleb whispered, his heart racing. His eyes scanned the pile, his breath shallow. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he took a few cautious steps forward. Suddenly, there was a sound, a shuffling noise, followed by the low groan of someone, or something, that had been hiding in the gym. Caleb's blood ran cold. "Get down," he shouted, pushing John and Emily to the floor. But it was too late. A figure lurched from behind the pile of gym bags, a man covered in grime and torn clothing. His face was gaunt, his eyes vacant, but the unmistakable hunger in them was clear. "Look out!" Emily screamed, scrambling to her feet, but Caleb was already moving, tackling the man to the ground before he could get any closer. The infected man hissed, swiping at Caleb with unnaturally fast movements. Caleb struggled to hold him down, his arms straining as the man fought back, gnashing his teeth. The gymnasium had become a battlefield in an instant. "John, Emily, get something!" Caleb shouted, his voice ragged. "Anything!" John grabbed a nearby broken chair, using it as a makeshift weapon, and swung it at the infected man, hitting him in the back with a loud crack. The man howled in pain, but it didn't stop him. His grip on Caleb tightened. Emily, her face pale but determined, found a large metal rod nearby and jabbed it into the infected man's side. The creature let out an agonizing scream, and with one final thrust, Caleb twisted the man's head, snapping his neck with a sickening crack. The body went limp, collapsing to the floor with a thud. Caleb stood, panting heavily, his hands shaking as he wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, his voice barely audible. John and Emily nodded, their faces pale but relieved. "We're good," John said, his voice low. "But this place, it's not safe. There's more of them out there. I can feel it." Caleb's mind raced as he looked around the gym. The quiet had returned, but it was the kind of silence that signaled danger, not safety. The walls of this place, the memories of what it used to be, felt like they were closing in on them. Caleb knew the infected wouldn't be far behind. "We need to find another place," Caleb said, his voice filled with resolve. "The school isn't the sanctuary we thought it was. We move out. Now." As they prepared to leave, Caleb glanced around one last time, the weight of their decisions heavy on his shoulders. Every step they took in this world brought them closer to the edge. They could only keep moving, keep surviving. The moment they stopped was the moment they would be lost forever. The world had changed. And Caleb had no intention of letting it take him down without a fight. The group moved swiftly through the school's labyrinthine hallways, their footsteps muffled on the old, worn floors. Caleb led the way, John and Emily following closely behind, each of them carrying the weight of their own thoughts and fears. Their earlier encounter with the infected man in the gym had only reinforced what they had all been feeling deep down: the world they once knew was gone, and there was no place left that could be considered safe. The school's atmosphere felt increasingly oppressive, as if it were closing in on them. They had barely stepped out of the gym when they heard the distant groans again. This time, they were closer. The infected were coming. "Move faster," Caleb hissed, his voice sharp with urgency. "We need to get to the back exit before they trap us." They rounded a corner and came to a narrow hallway that led to the back door. The windows were covered in grime and dust, but faint daylight filtered through, casting long shadows across the walls. Caleb's mind raced. They had no plan, no backup. The school, once a symbol of normalcy, had now become just another dangerous structure in a world full of ruins. As they neared the back door, Caleb's heart skipped a beat. The door was ajar, but beyond it, there was movement, shambling figures, just visible through the crack. "There's no way out the back," John whispered, his voice tight with dread. "We're trapped." Caleb turned to him, his eyes wide with panic. "Then we'll have to fight our way out. Get to the roof, maybe we can find a way down from there." Emily, her face pale and weary, shook her head. "What if it's worse up there? What if there's nowhere to go after that?" Caleb's mind whirled. There had to be something. They couldn't just sit here and wait for the infected to close in. They were running out of options, and fast. He glanced over at the lockers lining the walls, their rusted metal doors a reminder of the security the school had once offered, before everything fell apart. "We need to make a choice," Caleb said, the weight of his words sinking in. "Either we take our chances and head to the roof, or we try to fight through the back. If we stay here too long, we won't have any choices left." John stepped up, his face grim but resolute. "I say we fight. We're not making it out if we hesitate. We can get through the back door." Emily hesitated, her eyes searching the hallway, the distant groans of the infected growing louder. Finally, she nodded. "I trust you, Caleb. Let's go." With a deep breath, Caleb turned back to the door. They had no other choice but to move forward. Slowly, cautiously, they approached the back door, the sounds of the infected growing louder as they neared. Caleb's hand hovered over the door handle. Every moment felt like a life-or-death decision. He swung the door open quickly, and the group surged forward, charging into the chaos that lay beyond. The first infected came at them like a blur, its body jerking and spasming with every step. Caleb shoved it aside with all his strength, sending it crashing into a pile of debris. But there were more. Always more. The street outside the school was eerily silent, but it didn't last long. The moment they stepped into the open, more of the infected appeared, drawn by the sound of the door. They were everywhere, lumbering, twisted figures that moved with a frightening persistence. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as he swung his makeshift weapon, a large metal pipe, at the nearest infected. The pipe connected with the creature's skull with a sickening thud, and it crumpled to the ground in a heap. "Keep moving!" Caleb shouted, his voice raw with fear and urgency. John and Emily fought beside him, using whatever they could find to fend off the oncoming horde. Every swing of the pipe, every stomp, every shove took a toll on them. They were fighting for their lives. And yet, with every blow, the reality of their situation became clearer. This was no longer just a struggle for survival. It was a battle against the inevitability of a world that had lost its meaning. The infected were relentless, but so were they. Caleb could feel the sweat pouring down his back, his muscles burning with each movement. There was no time to think, only to act. As they fought their way down the street, Caleb's mind raced. He could hear the groans of the infected all around them. They were getting closer. He didn't know how long they could keep this up. Ahead, he saw a building that might offer some hope. A small pharmacy, its windows intact, its doors slightly ajar. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "Over there!" Caleb yelled, pointing to the pharmacy. "We can make it!" The group pushed forward, dodging and striking as they moved. Caleb's breath was ragged, his arms aching, but they had to reach the pharmacy. They had no other choice. But just as they neared the door, the street seemed to explode with movement. From every direction, more infected emerged from the shadows, their groans echoing through the empty streets. "This is it," Emily said quietly, her voice trembling. "We're not going to make it." Caleb turned to her, his face set in grim determination. "We will. We have to." With everything they had left, they made one final dash for the pharmacy. They burst through the door just as the infected closed in, slamming it behind them and barricading it with anything they could find. Inside, the silence was deafening. They stood there for a moment, panting, the adrenaline slowly beginning to wear off. The groans of the infected were muffled now, but Caleb knew that it wouldn't last long. The reality was setting in. They had found temporary shelter, but their fight was far from over. Caleb turned to John and Emily, his gaze unwavering. "We stay here tonight. Tomorrow, we find a way out. We keep moving, and we keep fighting. That's all we can do." The world had changed. There was no going back to the way things were. The rules had shifted, and the only choice they had now was to adapt, to survive. And survive, Caleb vowed to himself, they would.